Hi, good afternoon, civic students. This is the lecture for Wednesday. We're continuing our exploration of the presidency. And we talked last time about presidential power, that the tools in the toolkit, so to speak, and we looked at all those different offices, the cabinet positions, the executive office of the president, and then all those independent regulatory agencies that in a lot of ways are really independent of presidential authority and power. But the bottom line is that if you looked at the presidency today and you compared it to what it was with George Washington, one of the first real just big differences is just the number of people that work for the president in a variety of ways, right? Not just in terms of working directly, but under the executive branch. And I do think that one of the big issues for us moving forward is this job just too much for one person? Have we created such a large executive branch that it's impossible for one person to actually manage it? And are all the people in the executive branch actually working for the president, or do they have their own agendas? I think there was clearly an issue there in terms of impeachment, where there was large swaths of the executive branch that really had nothing to do with the election of Trump and probably didn't vote for him and didn't approve of his policies. And that's, of course, everyone is free to do that. But if you're working for the executive branch, there's this whole idea of democratic accountability. If you elect a president for a 4-year term, the expectation is that that person is supposed to direct the executive branch how he wants to, because he's been elected by the public. Of course, it's up to the president to decide how much he pushes for, and whether it's just for his party coalition or something else. But that really is a big issue for us, I think. And I think that's a nice little segue to presidential authority, because all of these new powers, these new authorities, these new tools that the president has in terms of staff and agencies, and all this new legislation that allows him to declare emergencies. That's what he's doing. The president is doing now with this coronavirus. It all suggests a much bigger presidency. But, and here's the important but, that's power. But does power equal authority? And so we're going to make this distinction between raw political power and the ability to influence people within the American political scene. And so this idea of, it's almost like soft power, influence, persuasion. That's the type of authority that I'm going to talk about. And not every president, even modern presidents with all these new powers, have authority. And there's a reason for that. And a lot of it has to do with party politics and coalitions and the kind of the broad arc of American political history. So we're going to be kind of doing a lot of sweeping generalizations about where presidents over time have laid within the broad sweep of party coalitions. More on that in a second. So some administrative notes before we proceed. Today we're going to be talking about presidential authority. Today what is due is the Google form for presidential power. So that was lecture 2 for Monday. You should have already submitted yesterday, Tuesday, the Google form for lecture number 1 on Monday, which basically provided a historical overview of the office. Okay, so we've got, if you've noticed on RenWeb, there's several links to great presidential speeches of all time, and we're going to be talking a lot about speech making today. So I would encourage you to look at that. We're also, some of the speeches that I have are from FDR, who is one of the kind of pioneers of presidential rhetoric, and particularly this new medium of radio. So he would give these what we call fireside chats during the Great Depression. And gosh, hopefully we don't have another Great Depression. I don't think we will. I don't think this economic crisis is something that's happening because of some problem within the markets. It has a lot to do with these forced governmental closures of businesses. But anyway, he would communicate directly with the American public through this medium of radio. And one of the things I think we'll talk about is how does Trump kind of replicate that today? Well, he uses something called Twitter, a new form of communication that allows him to go directly to the American public. So just kind of keep that in mind, that oftentimes presidents, particularly during times of crisis, are looking for ways to talk directly to the American public. So I would just point out that on RenWeb you can go and check out these different sites and these different speeches. The other thing I would point out too is that there's a link of uselectionatlas.org. So when we start talking today about critical elections and realignment, you can actually go on that website and click on particular election years and see who is running, which states voted for which party, and you can kind of see, if you do enough of kind of fiddling around on that map, is that you can see how the country has changed over time in terms of what regions of the country are Republican, which are Democrat, which were Federalist, which were Whig, all of those kinds of things. So one of the major points I'm going to try to make today is that there's actually a correlation between presidents that we consider to be effective or influential or great. You know, we hear that word great. Who are the great presidents? Well, these are people that came to office at a time when their particular political party was kind of on the rise, all right, and that gave them a tremendous amount of freedom within which to move and to act and to persuade, and it just so happens that some of our presidents that we consider to be least effective, least great, bad presidents, they come to office at a time when their particular coalition is kind of petering out, and one of the reasons for that is that these party coalitions, they only last about a generation or a little bit more, and they usually are determined by a particular issue or set of issues that need to be dealt with. You know, like for example, slavery. That was something that the majority, the Democratic Party of Jackson, they were the majority party. They were the dominant party. They were the ones that controlled most of the political offices, whether it's at the local level, state legislatures, governors, members of Congress, and ultimately the presidency. And so they had tried to deal with that issue and deal with other issues, but the slavery question just kept popping up. And eventually it destroyed what we call the second party system. So my point is, these coalitions last about a generation or a little bit more. And what usually happens is that new issues, new problems, new concerns come to the fore. And because of that, it reshuffles the electoral deck. And it usually takes just a change of about 4 or 5 percentage points of people switching parties and third parties emerging that actually end up shifting the balance of power. And when that occurs, parties and presidents that were on the rise are now on the decline. And guess what? Those presidents tend to be the ones that don't really work out all that well. So again, is it just the person? Is it their charisma? Is it their political skills? Or is it something else? So that's what we'll be addressing today. One other thing before we start, just trying to kind of follow up on, we've got a real interesting kind of test case, a case study in how a bill becomes a law. We're kind of waiting with bated breath whether Congress will be able to pass this stimulus package that a lot of people believe needs to be passed because, the government created the economic crisis because they closed all these businesses down. Then what are they going to do in the short term? And again, we pray that it's a short-term thing to kind of give capital to consumers so they can continue to spend, and also they're going to be kind of backstopping these financial institutions and these big industries so that they can continue to keep people on salary, and they can get loans from banks. Well, they need more capital, and Congress is basically going to pass a package that's going to basically take tax dollars. Basically, they're going to borrow money today, pay it back in the future to try to put this, keep this thing from going into a full-fledged recession and or depression. And I think they can do it, but here's the problem. We've got rules, legislative rules. In the Senate, you got to get 60 votes to stop a filibuster. And what's happening right now is that the Senate Democrats under Chuck Schumer, who I think I've just read here that he's probably going to be facing a primary challenge with AOC. It sounds like AOC wants to be senator, and she wants to take on Chuck Schumer. So Chuck Schumer wants to try to hold that off, and so he has been holding up this legislation for some pet projects of the Democratic left. And now the House of Representatives has come up with their own bill. Let me see here. Yeah, it says that there's provisions for a Green New Deal mandate on airlines to offset their carbon emissions. And then there's stuff about election reform. So really, remember that constitutional amendment you guys wanted to pass about making legislation only about one topic and not having all these non-germane amendments. Well, this is exactly what's happening right now. And at the time that I'm talking to you on late Tuesday afternoon, they haven't passed it yet. So we'll see. But that shows you that these rules of the game, so to speak, they're actually kind of important, especially when we're dealing with a crisis. And that's another great segue for the presidency, because one of the major reasons why the presidency has gained particularly power, maybe not so much authority, but power, is because of these crises that have occurred, particularly when we're talking about civil wars and depressions and recessions and things of that nature, civil rights. And so so keep that in mind. There's always this desire among politicians of either party to use a crisis and accentuate the power of government, and particularly the governmental power of executives. Okay, so I gave you this picture here, right? Here's the questions that I want you to keep in mind as you listen to the lecture. Why is the presidency such a disruptive force in American politics? Is that the role it was supposed to play according to the founding fathers? So we're going to talk about disruption. And then we're going to kind of get into some real presidency political science here. What are party systems? So these are systems of we have a two-party system. So we've got two major political parties. Which one is the majority party in the country? Which one is the minority party in the country? So there's a way of kind of determining that. I would argue today that actually, because we have weak party allegiances, that maybe this theory is breaking down a little bit, but for most of American history, it's really actually quite fascinating how this explains a lot. And that's what political science really is all about, is trying to explain what happens in our political system. What is a critical election? Talk about that. And then what is realignment? And so realignment, just to cut to the chase, is when that majority party out there, I can give you an example, the Jacksonian Democrats, they kind of controlled American politics for about 40 years. And they did that. That doesn't mean they won every election, but they won most of them at the local, state, and federal level. And then how have these affected presidential authority? And so that's really the connection, right? How have these fluctuations in party control of government affected the ability of presidents to do what they can do? Next question, what are the three major constituencies that presidents have long sought to persuade? What skills are useful for which constituencies? How effective have presidents been historically in going above the heads of Congress and marshaling public opinion in favor of their governing priorities? So increasingly, and I would argue this is something that really started happening in the early 20th century, but it has continued today. This kind of almost mystical desire on the part of presidents go out and give a great speech and then go from place to place to place and try to drum up support for their project, their bill that's going to change the world for the better. You can tell that I'm a little skeptical of this. And so then what happens? Their power of rhetoric and persuasion is so great that then the people rise up and they call their members of Congress, say, "Oh my gosh, I just heard the president. You got to do this, that, or the other." And then what members of Congress supposed to do? They're supposed to kind of go, and they're not quite sure about it, but they're worried about their reelection chances, and so they go along with this great idea of the president. Does that work? That's the question. And then finally, what are the dangers of the presidency becoming more of a marketing brand than a governing institution? And so this gets back to the kind of the original dilemma of does this office of the president actually fit in with what we would hope to be a republic? So a lot to do. Let's get to it. So first of all, we talked a little bit about this coronavirus stuff. All I would say is that I think that there's a lot of opportunities right now for the president to exercise unilateral power. Congress has given the president power over the course of the last 30, 40 years to do things like declare national emergencies. Now, I actually think there's some question about whether there's the constitutionality of those, but Congress certainly has granted power to the president to do that. But does that give him the influence, the authority to kind of be listened to by the American public? You know, there was an example that I think President Trump tweeted over the weekend, or maybe late last week, that there was actually these medicines that were designed to treat malaria. And he said, well, you know, it looks like that there's some real interesting possibilities that they could be used as kind of a stopgap measure until we get what do you call it, a antivirus. And so what happens? People go out, they buy it. There's a run on the market. Now they can't find this stuff, and there's actually people with malaria that they don't have the medicine anymore. Well, you know, that's presidential communication. Has he undercut his own authority by trying to, communicate with the American public there? And with more presidential power, does that necessarily mean he's more effective and more influential in getting what he wants to get done? And we're going to see over the course of these next couple of weeks. There's already some indications that the president is somewhat skeptical of a long-term shutdown of the American economy, and he's been talking in some ways the way that we were discussing before we left on Thursday and Friday before we left when the school got closed down, about what are the pros and cons of doing this. Obviously, it's going to help prevent the spread of the virus, but is that outweighed by maybe people losing their jobs and becoming so stressed out that they are actually have problems with their own health? And also, just is it worth that kind of cost benefit analysis? So we'll see. This is very not dangerous, I guess, but this is kind of treacherous political ground that I think the president is walking on right here. And people are watching, partly because there's not a lot to do other than watch these great lectures, right? You can watch what's going on in presidential politics. He gives a daily briefing now, so we'll see. This distinction between power and authority, I think, is playing out in front of our eyes, right? Presidents they're the most powerful than they've ever been, but do they have authority? Okay. All right. So the next topic here is president as disruptor. And again, I've taken a picture of my whiteboard. Hopefully, it helps you follow along with what I'm saying here, because I do refer to it. Now, what does this mean that the president is a disrupting force in American politics? Well, you know, if you think about the three branches of government. You've got Congress. It's a bicameral legislature. The House has grown as the size of the country has grown, and so has the Senate. You've got 535 members of Congress. Then you have, what, 50 state legislatures, both except for Nebraska, all with House and Senate. They have governors. So there's a lot of politicians running around. And they have their own kind of modus operandi. They have their own election cycles. They have their own terms of office. They have their own powers, right? But because it is a collegial body, multi-membered body, one person really can't do a whole lot. Now, a governor maybe can, okay? And so there's some similarities between governors. And I mean, think about these awesome powers that Governor Whitmer is exercising in closing down businesses and closing down schools. That's a lot of power, okay? And so governors and presidents have this incentive because what's the main difference? It's kind of obvious, but it's one person, not several. And so they click their fingers and they can get stuff done. They can make pronouncements. And if the legislative bodies at the state level or at the national level give these executives authority, they're going to use it, and they have. And so there's an incentive, in other words, to act in a way that I think that is not necessarily the case with legislative bodies. In some ways, what do we call them? Like parliaments. Well, that's a French word, parler meaning to talk, and mont meaning house. It's a speaking house. So what do legislative bodies do? They debate, they argue, they discuss, they deliberate, and then maybe they act. And you can see, I think it's actually amazing that they've gotten the stimulus bill as far as they have. Well, they weren't talking about it last week, and now they're almost past it, but people are complaining that they're not acting fast enough. Well, that's light speed, according to how really a bill becomes a law. But that's the nature of a legislative body. It's supposed to act slowly. But with presidents, and Hamilton talks about this in Federalist 70, there's a good thing that happens when you have energy, quote unquote, in the executive. That the executives can kind of put certain issues onto the nation's agenda in a way that a member of Congress maybe has a more difficult time doing. And as a result of that, if the country needs to act in a definitive way, in a quick way, to deal with an emergency, Hamilton thought that was a good idea. Okay, so there is this kind of, the fact that we have a unitary one-person executive, and they're given independent powers, not like a parliamentary system. They're not prime ministers. They have their own independent source of political power. They are elected independently. And therefore, what happens is that all presidents want to act. And it's natural. Now, here's the problem. If you are one person and you want to have a legacy, and let's face it, all presidents want a positive legacy. How many of them have there been in American history? 40 some odd, right? So you want to go down in the history books, right, as somebody who's done something well for the country. And so you're competing with the great presidents of all time. And because of that, very few of them will decide that maybe the best course of action is not to act. Now, as a statesman, I actually think there's plenty of opportunities when you should not act. I think right now there's a possibility that maybe at some point the government needs to not act, to basically stop doing what they are doing in order to maybe get things going back to normal. But that's going to be kind of an exercise in what? Humility. Well, most politicians are not humble. They want to act. And because of that, if you look over the course of time, regardless of when a president becomes a president, they're going to act. And in some cases, maybe the decision to act is contrary, actually contradicts their own political fortunes. See what I mean? So we have this unitary executive. There's a natural tendency for them to want to act for their own legacy and also just to do the right thing. But do they have kind of the internal fortitude and the humility to sometimes say, well, we ought not to act in this particular circumstance? But according to this kind of theory, most don't. And because of that, if they come to power at a time when it's not conducive to getting things done and the way they want to get done, what's going to happen is that they're going to disrupt the political system. They're going to kind of almost, it's almost like putting a virus in a computer. It's going to spread and things are going to get chaotic. Okay? And you think about a Trump, man, this guy's disruptive, isn't he? Now maybe he's coming at a time in political history where that's exactly what the American public wants. All right? And so after I developed this theory, one of the things I want you to ponder is, where does Trump fit in this theory? Okay? All right, so that's president as disruptor. All right, let's talk about topic 3. So this is, I want to introduce 3 kind of fundamental, all related political science concepts. The first is the notion of party systems. So if you look at American political history, you just have to kind of take it from me that we have a 2-party system. When we get to political parties, I'll discuss why that is. But we have 2 major political parties. We don't have 3, 4, 5. Now we have third parties that have emerged over the course of history, and they actually play a role in this theory that I'm just about ready to explain. Okay, but they don't really last all that long. Third parties. It's the 2 major parties. Now they've changed names over time, but really, you know, if you think about American history, you've had one party that seems to be the party of property, the party of business, the party that of kind of more the elite party, all right? And then you've had another party that's more of a populist party, a party of quote unquote the little guy. Now, both sides try to appeal to both of these entities, but you get the drift, right? Well, there's been a fight between these 2 kind of coalitions over time. And what happens is that depending upon the circumstance, depending upon the issues, and of course the issues that divided the parties, and think about 1776, what was dividing the parties then? Whether you want to declare independence or not. Well, that's very different than the issue in 1860. Should slavery extend to the territories or not? Or whether it's 1932, whether the big issue is, should the federal government get involved in regulating the private economy or not? Or how about in 1980, where the big issue when Reagan comes to power is taxes and also our relationship with the Soviet Union. Should we accommodate the evil empire? And again, that's one of the speeches that I actually put on the list there. Or should we we should not just contain it, but should we actually defeat it? Right? So those are big issues that divide it. So regardless of that, you've got these 2 major parties and they're vying for control. Okay? Well, if you look at American history, these systems, right? So we have these party systems, and they have kind of dominated particular eras of political history. So, for example, at the very, very beginning of our country's history, we had Federalists who favored a stronger national government, and we had Anti-Federalists who morphed into something called the Democratic Republicans. Their favorite politician was Jefferson. Hamilton was the favorite politician for the Federalists, and they kind of fought it out. They fought it out at the Constitutional Convention, and they kept on fighting during the administration of George Washington and John Adams. But what ended up happening was that there was a critical election. So that's another theory here, right? So if you look at American history, there have been, I think, 5 definitive critical elections where it became clear that there was a majority party that was dominant and on the rise, and a minority party that had either lost power or never had it to begin with. Okay, so in the case of 1800, for example, that was our first critical election. The Federalists had dominated. Washington was a Federalist, Adams was a Federalist, Hamilton was a Federalist, and a lot of these policies that got put into place, whether it was ratification of the Constitution or Hamilton's economic plan, whatever it was, Federalists were kind of had control of that. But then by 1800, you get a new coalition that emerges to stop some of these Federalist policies, and Jefferson is the man. And at that point, you have a critical election. 1800 is it, and there's a switch, and then you get a new majority party. So do you understand that? Right. So we have majority party, minority party, and a switch. That's what we mean by there's a party system, 2 political parties going at each other, One's on the rise, one's down, and then whew, you have a switch. Sometimes you actually get such a switch that one party kind of just disappears. The Federalists are no more, right? Now, what later replaces them is something called the Whig Party. And the Whig Party is kind of just a funky name that they took from British politics to represent the party that was against kingly power. And they called Andrew Jackson a king because he was vetoing a bunch of bills, so they thought he was being like a dictator. And so you get a new party system. So what are these critical elections? 1800 is one. 1828, that's when Andrew Jackson becomes president and defeats John Quincy Adams and takes over the presidency there. So then we get 1860, who gets elected then? Our friend Lincoln. And he becomes this new Republican Party, replaces the Whig Party, and takes some portions of the Democratic Party with it. And that usually happens, usually when you have a switch in majority control. And how do you determine that? Well, going back, political scientists look at how many seats, state legislative seats, did the political parties have? How many governorships does the political party control? How often did they win the presidency during a period of time? How often did they control the House? How often did they control the Senate? And again, you're never going to have the party control everything at all times. There's different regions of the country, and they have different. Think about today. The South is strong Republican. Never was Republican in the 19th century. And where was the home of the Republican Party? It was in the Northeast. Now, complete switch, right? Okay, so 1860, 1896, where really the Republican Party maintains its majority status, but it's a new kind of Republican Party. It's not the Republican Party of Lincoln. It's the party of McKinley and big business. And that lasts until 1932, when FDR and the New Deal coalition, a new branch where one of the big switches is that the African Americans had long been Republican, and now they're not. They switched party allegiances to the Democratic Party, and that's what usually happens. Now, one reason why the Republican Party is doing much better in Congress and state legislatures and governorships today than it did in the 1950s and 60s is because the solid Democratic South has shifted from Democrat to really strong Republican. But also, the Northeast has switched from Republican to Democrat. So there's an even-stevenness to all this. And then finally, I would argue that the last critical election, and there's a bit of controversy about this, but I think it holds up because really in 1972, Nixon won 49 states, and it looked like the Republican Party was kind of rising. But then you had Watergate, impeachment, and then the Democrats took control back. But then you get the election of Reagan. The Republicans take over the Senate for the first time since 1954. And while they didn't take over the House, there was a lot of Southern Democrats that voted for Reagan's program. And so he had kind of a working majority in the House. And then, of course, eventually, by the 90s, even with the power of incumbency and all of that, by 1994, the Republicans actually do take over the House. And so there's kind of a center-right coalition that takes over with Reagan that really stayed in power, I would argue, till Obama. And so now we're actually during this, we have this very weird situation now where it's very evenly divided, and there's a big question mark about whether this whole theory kind of works or not anymore. Okay, but these critical elections have occurred over time, and you get a switch in majority party control, and what that switch is called realignment. Okay, so party systems, critical elections, realignment. Well, how does this relate to the presidency? All right, so you've got a situation where there have been presidents who have come to power at a time of a critical election. All right, and so and again, if you look at the picture of the whiteboard, I've got on there, I've got presidents and party systems, okay? And so I've got a listing of, there's 4 categories. So a president is either ascendant, affirming, opposed, or declining, okay? And what does that mean? That means that, let's say, you are a president and you've just been elected, and the Democratic Party has just taken over the of control of the country, essentially, right? You would then be ascendant, okay? Now, affirming means that you are not the first president in that situation, but maybe two election cycles later, maybe 10, 15 years later, you're a party president of the same party, and you're affirming the issues and the policy stances of that original realigning election. Okay? And then if you're opposed, what that means is that sometimes if you are a member of the minority party, the party that doesn't control most of American politics, there are still instances when you can win elections, and there's actually a fair number of presidents that have done so. And in a moment, I'll talk to you about what usually happens to those kind of guys. And then there are presidents who are elected at the tail end of a party system. So these are the presidents that are, hanging on for dear life, so to speak. And then when they are defeated, that's when the new party comes to control. Get it? All right, hopefully you got it. So ascendant, affirming, opposed, declining. So here are, and again, look at that picture that I've uploaded, and it'll show this. But who are the ascendant presidents? Jefferson, 1800. Jackson, 1828. Lincoln, 1860. FDR, 1932. Reagan, 1980. Now, of those presidents, and you could probably throw Washington in there because I would argue that's a realigning election, but it wasn't between Americans, it was between America and Britain. So what do all those presidents have in common? They are considered either great or near great. Well, why? Well, maybe it's because of their great political skills. Maybe it's because of their great oratory. Maybe it's because they were great leaders. Or maybe they were the ones that represented the new way of thinking, that we are going to deal with an issue in a new way. And Lincoln is a perfect example of that. Lincoln wanted to stop the spread of slavery in the territories. He gets elected, and what does the South do? They secede. Now, in some ways, you might argue that that is actually a sign of political failure, not success. But anyway, over time, he keeps the Union together, and so he's considered a great president. And what happens? His new Republican Party becomes the majority party, and they're the ones that end up kind of fixing the nation. Okay? So those are the ascendant presidents. Then you have affirming presidents. These are presidents that come after the people who have realigned the political system. They are not contrary to the majority party. They are consistent with the majority party. So who are they? Madison. So he's just kind of doing what Jefferson did. Polk is doing what Jackson did. Garfield is doing what Lincoln did. Harding is trying to do what McKinley was doing, big business republicanism. Truman was trying to do what FDR was doing, and I would argue Bush won. Herbert Walker Bush is doing what Reagan was trying to do. So those are affirming presidents. Now, are they considered failures? No, but they're not considered the greatest presidents, right? They're considered to be kind of just going with the flow. They're going with the flow presidents, right? Then you have opposed presidents. Now, these are fascinating guys because they come to office at a time when they are kind of outsiders. They are opposed to the dominant party of the time. John Adams, even though he's a Federalist, he's not really a strong Federalist, and he doesn't really get along with anybody. And he's somebody that's pushing the boundaries of both the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. John Tyler, a famous Tippecanoe and Tyler too. You had William Henry Harrison, who, and he's an opposed as well. He was a Whig. Okay, I would also put Zachary Taylor there. So they're not Democrats, but they're war heroes, and they end up winning the presidency. But they have failed. Both of them die young in office, and Tyler took over for Harrison, and he's almost impeached. And that impeachment is a trend for these opposed presidents. Andrew Johnson, right? He takes over when Lincoln is assassinated. He's actually a Democrat because Lincoln put him on the ticket to kind of try to show national unity. Well, what happens in Johnson? He is impeached and almost one vote from being removed. Then you have Cleveland, Grover Cleveland. Now he's the exception that proves the rule, and I would put him and Eisenhower in an almost special category. He was a Democrat in a Republican age, but he was actually a very successful president. And so there's lessons there, right? He didn't really try to disrupt as much. He didn't act as much. Now he did pick a couple of big issues, particularly on money. He was a gold Democrat. He was not an inflationary Democrat, and it actually cost him support within his own party, but it actually bought him support among Republicans. So he was able to actually kind of walk that fine line. Woodrow Wilson, he's a Democrat during the Republican ascendancy, well, World War One. Gets a lot done actually. The Democrats have control of Congress for 2 years, and man, they get a lot done. But what ends up happening to him? He tries to go over the heads of Congress with this League of Nations, and I would argue that he was effectively impeached because they stopped him, and then he dies of a stroke. Eisenhower, I would put him with Cleveland as the only two opposed presidents that actually were successful, because he also did not seek to disrupt the system in which he was operating in. Nixon, impeached and resigned. Clinton, impeached, didn't resign. And then how about Trump? So this is one of the big questions. Is he opposed to a new Democratic ascendancy that was brought forth by Obama? Or is he the realigning president who is taking away working class Union Democrats and making them Trump Republicans? So the jury is still out on this, but he's got kind of attributes of both. Okay, and then who are the declining presidents? These are John Quincy Adams. He got shellacked. He wins in 1824 because the Electoral College was deadlocked, and he ended up getting support from Henry Clay and got the presidency. But then 4 years later, Jackson creates the Democratic Party and shellacks him. Buchanan, he's the president before Lincoln. You know what happened to him? He gets defeated. He actually doesn't even get renominated by his own party. Herbert Hoover, the Republican when the stock market crashed, and you didn't hear from him after that in the Republican Party really until the 1970s. And then Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter gets shellacked by Reagan in 1980. And these are guys that are kind of hanging on to the ruling coalition that ends up kind of going up in smoke. Okay? So that's the theory. So who are the people that have more authority? Who are the people that can influence? Well, it's people that come to power at a particular time in American political history. Okay? And so is it any wonder that these are the people that are considered great? Because it's almost like all of their opposition has been completely mowed over, and then they can move in and try to create new ideas and new programs. Okay? Now, who are they trying to persuade? This is we got a couple of quick little topics to get through, and then we'll be done. In terms of the power to persuade, this is another kind of soft power, right? More like authority, more like influence, and not raw power. Congress. So how's Trump doing with that? Is he persuading Chuck Schumer to go along with this stimulus plan? We'll see. Both are New Yorkers. Actually, Trump probably gave to Schumer's campaigns earlier before he became a politician. So we'll see. Some presidents were better at persuading Congress than another constituency, which was kind of like the folks back home, the public. Reagan was really, really good at persuading the public, using speeches to kind of sway public opinion. He was an actor. He was good at it. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was a legislator all his life, he was not very good in front of the camera, but he was very good behind the scenes in the corridors of congressional politics. And so he could twist arms kind of in the back room, so to speak. And then you had this kind of middle ground, not just state party leaders, but also kind of business leaders basically people back home that aren't just the public, but people who are kind of leaders in their fields, a lot of whom were responsible for helping you get elected in the first place or trying to get you unelected. So those are the three kind of constituencies, and depending upon your skill set, you see presidents who have maybe the ability to persuade Congress but not the public. Maybe the public but not the people back home. Maybe the people back home but not those business leaders. So there's a little bit of a difference there, okay? Well, what that leads to is that I think there's been a kind of almost a temptation. I call this the rhetorical presidency, a temptation on the part of modern presidents to use these cool new communication mediums, radio, television, Twitter, to kind of, and I've talked about this before, go over the heads of the members of Congress, influence the public, and then have the public kind of bash Congress into submission. Now, sometimes those things have worked. Teddy Roosevelt did it for antitrust legislation, but Woodrow Wilson failed when trying to get the League of Nations passed. Ronald Reagan was successful in getting tax cuts through with this kind of rhetorical strategy, but Clinton was failed in terms of trying to get health care reform passed. And then think about the presidents with no communication skills. Nixon, Carter, I would argue both Bush 1 and Bush 2. Little bit harder to kind of pigeonhole, but not exactly people that are going to be going down in history as great presidents. Bush 2 is actually an interesting case because he was a wartime president, and I think that the fact that, and it was a war that in some ways was brought upon our shores by 9/11, but that second war, Iraq, was actually a war of choice that almost got him in trouble politically. And he wasn't able to, he didn't have a lot of communication skills to kind of get the American people behind that second war. And then who are the presidents with good communication skills? Teddy, especially in the modern era, Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, FDR, Kennedy, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, and I would argue Trump. So in some ways, this power to persuade, this power to influence, which is a subtle thing and not so much a raw power thing, I think it's deeply connected with the ability of a president to communicate. And if that's the case, then are we setting up a situation where the constitutional presidency, right, the things that the Constitution wants the president to be, the commander-in-chief, the chief executive, the person that's going to kind of, in some ways, stop bad things from happening, but really not promoting all that much, right? Let Congress make the law. Well, that's not really what we're looking for today as a president. Who are we looking for? Is it a chief entertainer in office, right? A CEO, chief entertainer. Well, is that really what we want as a president? Or do we want somebody who actually has the skills and skill set that the Constitution lays out? And in some ways, it's a very interesting scenario, right? If you look at the Article 2, you can almost look at that as a job description, right? So if you were like listing a job, hey, help wanted person, what does he have? Military skills, the ability to manage large, far-flung organizations, right? That type of person might not get elected, might not be able to communicate with the public, but he might be able to do the job of president, right? So have we set up a situation where there is too much attention placed upon kind of this soft stuff, whereas we're not really looking at the hard stuff of the real constitutional duties of the president. And then we've got this entire deep state, this administrative state, that is not controlled by either Congress or the president. And that's something that we'll pick up on for my lecture tomorrow, where, you know, is it the case where all these different roles that the president is asked to play, has it become just an impossible leadership task? And that maybe we'd actually get a lot more out of our president if we dial down the expectations for the office itself. Okay, so that's what I have for today. We will be back tomorrow to end up our discussions on the presidency. Get those Google forms done. You'll have, you've got till tomorrow to answer the questions from this one, and then you'll have Friday to finish up Thursdays. All right, God bless you.